Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derek, and with me over there on the other side of the internet tubes is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, so we are continuing our discussion of Genesis 3:19. We talked about the first part of the verse last time, and today we're going to talk about the second part of the verse. So just to remind ourselves of it, I'm going to read it again real quickly. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. All right, so the meaning of dust here. This is an interesting one because I think there are several different ways to look at this, and it's not unreasonable to believe, as we've talked about a few times here through the early part of Genesis, that it may hold many different meanings at once. That is, after all, what good literature does. So, the first and perhaps most common belief is that this is a confirmation of the promise of death from the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I find this to be, let's say, the most strained understanding. There's not an explicit mention of death here. That's not to say that it might not be about that, but I think it's about something a little bit deeper than that. But and the death, by the way, is more a spiritual death, as we talked about, right? No one takes that on that day you shall die hyper literally, right? And so to refer to this, in such a physical death way, when what we were talking about before was a spiritual death, that doesn't quite seem to jive with me in terms of what is really being talked about here. So if we return to the dust thing again, right? On the surface level, we can see the idea of returning to dust. We sort of get, okay, maybe that is about death. Okay. And the idea we all are that without God. If we're going to look at it that way, as a confirmation, right, of what was I guess the consequence of sin, the death, then we would want to look at it from sort of a, well, what does that sort of signify perspective, right? And I think it emphasizes the futility, right, of the life that people will struggle through. So the preceding this, if you remember previous episodes, if you've listened to those, we have this buildup of just how difficult the task of life is going to be for the man here, for Adam. And at the end of that, you're dust again. So you've seemingly not made any real progress despite all of this effort.
Yeah.
Because you'll return to dust.
Yeah.
So if we're going to look at it that way, then I think you really want to emphasize in terms of your interpretation of this verse that it's describing then a sense of futility, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like the task of Sisyphus in like Greek mythology, is what
Yes.
It kind of feels like.
Yes.
Okay.
It is a bit like that. And it's obviously very bleak, right? And it speaks to, I think, the fragility of humanity, right? In terms of not really being able to get much further than being dust. And it's sort of the idea that this hard life at the end fades into dust. And it to me, that interpretation, again, it may be in there, but it foreshadows a little bit of something of the nihilism that Nietzsche sort of laid bare, right? That the idea that without God, the result of this life is nothing and returning to dust as our original form.
Yeah, I think it's obvious to see the universality of this idea, because that's why Nietzsche would be talking about it when he sees the decline of the church. And then you would see the same thing coming out of Greek culture, completely independent of any influence from the scriptures. And so this kind of futility, this understanding that this is the way in which life presents itself, which I think is really important, because you're looking at we're talking about Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, leaving the garden. So leaving what what the world looked like, and God is setting up what the world is going to be presented to them going forward, which is how the world's going to be presented to us, because we're not involved in Eden. And so this is a better statement of how the world is, whereas everything before this was talking about more so how God initially designed it to be.
Yes.
And so I think it's interesting that this pretty well encapsulates something that other people recognize independent of scriptures too. That feudal aspect of just life in general.
Right. Yeah. So that, I mean, there is, I guess, that way to take it, where it's portraying this sort of bleak future for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that is one spin on it. I think, again, we've talked about this story sort of being revelatory of us in terms of how we choose to sort of interpret things. And so if that's what you see when you look at it, that, I mean, sure, maybe that's there. But that would seem to then reveal something about the person who is interpreting it that way. Just at the other end of the spectrum, you could sort of look at it as maybe it captures some of the sweet release of death idea, right? Because you could look at it and say, well, having just described how difficult and brutal a life, under the circumstances of sin, just how difficult that will be. It's ultimately then a relief to know that we'll leave the dust of this behind. Because we talked before about how we are, in the previous chapter, we are in part dust and part God breathed, right? And so here at the end of this, right, is the idea, well, that the dust will remain behind, right? That part will fade and return to its original state. But then the God breathed part would continue on. So we might see that in this as well. If we look at that part being about death, if the dust specifically then is referring to human death and the death of the material aspect of us, well, then maybe it'll be nice to leave this weary world behind and the God breathed part continue on.
Yeah.
That's another thing you could potentially see in there, I guess.
There's part of me that pulls out the opposite side of that coin, that maybe this is saying you will never be fully God breathed, or in your current state you won't be at minimum, I guess, because that's the thing that the serpent tempts with, is he says you will be like a god, right. And this is almost saying, God's saying, no, you came from dust. You're not going to be like a god. You're going to go back to being dust. You can't pull yourself beyond that. Or at least that's what's being presented at this time.
Well, yeah, or the idea that at least while you are in the world, right? While you're in this world burdened by sin, you'll never become anything more than that, right? That dust part will stick with you. At the end, that dust part is going to go away. You're going to return to the dust, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't, I mean, again, we just read the previous chapter and saw the God breathed part. So we might then say, well, what about that component, right? And the implication being then, by that part not being described as well, hitting on dust, pointing very specifically to what was formed in the previous chapter, you would sort of look at it and say, well, then the God breathed part must continue. It doesn't mean that that's like a fullness of being like godlike. It just is the God breathed part. But the problem is, I mean, we would look at that and say, well, that's still only half of what it is to be a human, right? Which is true. Yeah. What it is to be human is to be the mix, is to be the mix of the dust and the God breathed. So we still would be incomplete in a sense.
Yeah, it's just interesting that God doesn't present the God breathed part at all in this circumstance. It almost feels, I don't want to read too much into it, but it feels like there's a tone in doing that, in the choice of saying that, and not referencing the God breathed at all. It's almost like it intentionally paints a bleak picture for humanity. Like, you need to look at that bleak picture square in the face. I talked about this or we've talked about this even a little bit too, about the idea of reading the Bible linearly. What tends to happen is we tend to read the Bible as though we always know that Christ is coming. We always know that Christ is coming, but it's
Right.
like, well, read it linearly for a sec, because for thousands of years people didn't have that. So like, or hundreds of years at minimum, that read it linearly, like go through it straight, and you. I think that becomes interesting because it's God is intentionally painting a bleak picture here, I think, and it's like there is,
for me, it poses a question.
if you wanted to look at it deeper, if you really wanted to be like, well, what are my reasons for hope? You could be like, well, he didn't mention the God breathed part, but he doesn't. And it's almost like that's kept as, that's like keeping part of his cards back. But
Oh,
he's
interesting. See, I
pointing
see it
out
as
first, like, this
causing us to
is,
ask the question.
if somebody is truly inquisitive and truly wants to push that, but most people aren't.
Well,
I think that's the reality too, which is also why you said the most obvious thing is, which is the thing that's normally used, this is used to represent, is that death happens. Is that
right,
you come into the world and you die.
right.
Which I think is also part of the truth. But if you push deeper to a level, you see this bleak picture being painted out. If you push deeper beyond that, yes, you find light. I mean, which actually is a Nietzsche idea too. If you look far enough into the darkness, you see light coming through the other end. And so, like, yes, and somehow that's all buried in here. But I think it's intentionally dark. It's intentionally
On
there
first reading, sure,
and
yeah,
second reading, maybe the third reading, then you're coming through to the other side and you're
maybe, yeah.
starting to say, okay, well, what didn't he talk about? Because if I look at that dust thing, it's like, man, this is all futile, and
Yeah, I
then you
mean,
can come to the other side and say, what about the God breathed part? So
yeah,
that's why I think this has power, though, because in a way, especially given the world as it's presented to us right now, as we see it, you don't understand all of the possible goodness in the world or the ways in which God is working unless you can look squarely in the face the ways in
oh, for
which
sure.
things are dark and
Yes, yeah.
bleak and
Mhm.
hopeless. And then you have a chance of understanding that. It's like the spoiled child who's had everything given to them in life, so they don't recognize the difficulty that it is to get those things.
Right, right,
So
right.
that's, I think it is, I think you're right that on the other side of this there is that hope, but it takes a while of looking squarely at that bleakness in order to see the hope on the other side, I guess.
Yes, yes, yeah. I mean, in so many things in the Bible too. I think on first reading, you might look at it and see it as, you might see the darkness in it, if you will,
Yeah.
right? You might see the weight of sin upon it. But as you read on, you begin to see the bits of hope, the bits of light within all of those things. I mean, just read the story of Christ, right? I mean, obviously, uh, very bleak, obviously big hopeful moment at the end. But if you reread the narratives of Christ's death, within it there becomes elements of hope, too. I mean, I think about it. It takes, I think, a few readings to really latch on to Jesus's discussion with the thieves on the crosses next to him, right? And to actually see the hopefulness that is in the conversation with, the one who basically repents, and sort of accepts who Jesus is in that moment. So the light of that on the first maybe many readings is not going to shine through so much. You're gonna see the darkness of the death, first. So yeah, I get what you're saying, that initially certainly this looks bleak and you have to sort of look through that darkness to start to see, possibilities within these things as well, and so at first you might look and say that to dust we will return. What a sad, pathetic thing, as we talked about, right? A bleak, difficult life, and at the end you're dust. But then you might eventually remember, wait, but we're part dust and part God breathed. And that part's not mentioned here. The fate of the God breathed part of us is not mentioned. So there's something interesting to that. There's a question posed, I guess, by the narrative as well. So, all right. Well, I want to look at one other way to look at this as well, sort of again in context with the whole section. Because I think what's being described here a little bit is a cyclical process, right? We see that by saying for dust you are, and this idea of, dust you came from and to dust you will return. So that tells us that there's something of a cycle born in this. And it is, so one of the things I want to just point out here is if you're someone in the Near East, the ancient Near East reading this, there's something you might look at in this that maybe our modern perspective doesn't do as well. Because it's more well understood in the Eastern world. And, we should remember Christianity is a Near Eastern religion. So there's some Eastern aspects to this. In the Eastern world, it's more understood that where we are is built upon the work of our ancestors, right? We're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors in terms of where we exist now. And so what that leads to in the East is all kind of interesting ancestor worship and those kind of things and all of that, right? And in a way, this verse acknowledges the reality of being built upon your ancestors while at the same time eliminating kind of the idea of worshiping them, right? Because they were just dust. But if we look at this verse, right, the idea is that man works and ends up as dust in the end, right? But then it also is reminding us at the same time that man comes from dust. So we can kind of look at that and see, well, the dust of one generation becomes the foundation for the next generation. It's a cycle. You will be brought back to dust, but that dust then becomes the next generation of God-breathed dust, if you will, as humans are. So we can see something of like a cyclical nature described here. And in a way, it's actually describing advancement too. It's describing the ways in which humanity will sort of come to cope with the reality of sin and the effects of sin. Because what we see here is that while it's describing scraping out a meager, existence that is not all that impressive, it does produce bread, right? So there is the production of something there. And so you start as dust and you return as dust, but in between you make bread. And that's something to think of, right? Because when we think of bread, it is something that sustains existence and can be used to, propel existence forward, particularly symbolically in these Old Testament and the New Testament too. That is what bread is. And we talked before about it being like the most meager thing that you could survive off of. And that is true, but you also can survive off it. You can use the bread to do something different, to propel you to something new. So what we can
the thing that bread tends to symbolize is, I don't want to necessarily assume it symbolizes this, but practically what it is its stability. It's stability to build something and to continue, because if you're dependent upon a good hunt, that's more of a roll of the dice, and it's a feast or famine strategy, whereas bread would be something that sustains. That generally,
you're still the whims of the harvest and all of that.
You still have famines and things like that, but that's where cities were able to be built, and where you had larger scale cultures able to build around the fact that they had some degree of dependability and could use less people in order to make more food. And so you're able to depend on this growing of a larger society, as opposed to just single person going out and looking to hunt for a very, very small tribe,
right?
Or small tribe going out and hunting for a small tribe. It doesn't scale properly. It doesn't allow you for dependability through the future. And plus, with harvests, sometimes you have surpluses, and we even see this later with Joseph in Genesis, is that you have surpluses and you can save them for times when there's famine. And so bread allows you to plan a little bit more for the future. So this cycle is allowed to take place.
It's a building block, So we saw in the previous episodes we talked about, I think it was just the last episode actually, we talked about the idea of bread being like the least that you could produce, right? It, it's a survival food. It's not a food of thriving, but at the same time, it is a building block. So what we then could look at this and see is the idea that you have a cyclical process where you start as dust, but you make a building block, and then you return to dust, but then your dust becomes the next generation, and then they build as well. So you might see the bread as advancement. And so you could see here a cyclical idea of generations successfully, their period of not being dust, advancing forward a little bit, and then the next generation carrying it forward, and the next generation carrying it forward. And I mean, we can see this in life as well, right? I mean, if you look at something like the Western world, it seems like these days to live in the West, like the minimum includes things like smartphones, which is a wild piece of technology. But that's only because the bread of the previous generations was, things like the telephone, writing before that, and electricity and microprocessors and all of these things built up to the point where now we have a cell phone, and that is more or less a basic. We survive off that bread from the previous generation. I think when we look here, we are seeing a little bit of this sort of cyclical idea where one generation provides the foundation, the bread for the next generation. And that's sort of described in this passage as well, which again, we might look at saying, okay, well, maybe that's actually a little bit of hopefulness, right? Because we talked about how you can look at it bleakly, but if this cyclical process is going, each time, if you're advancing and the bread is being made, the consequences of sin can be fought back against, if that makes sense, right? There will be a pushing back against the effects of sin as a result of this process.
Well, I think also, I mean, this is where I keep looking at the bleakness. Normally you're the pessimistic one and I'm the optimist, but
yeah, there you
go.
Just up until
I think looking
it was just up until what was it?
When you said this is the most joyful,
the bleakest moment, right before God talks to them. That was the bleakest moment. So since then, now I'm in the hopeful category.
Hey, you're optimistic.
Right?
All right, there we
we've
go.
Crossed over that plateau. We're now in the realm of hope.
What I think happens too is the bleakness of this. So this will be slightly optimistic. The bleakness of this acts as a motivator for the action that you're talking about as well. Is that now that I understand the actuality of my position in this world as it's going to present itself to me going forward, not what Eden was, but as it is now, that does then compel Adam, because this is being spoken to the man at least, but probably Eve as well, to look at their offspring and say that this is what I have to invest in order to do, in order to make things better. You see this in first generation folks who come to the United States. If you've ever met any of them, when they speak, it's really interesting. I know this is anecdotal, but most that I've met, they don't typically talk about pursuing a better life for themselves. They talk about pursuing a better life for their children.
Right.
That tends to be the thing that they're aspiring to.
Right.
And which is just very interesting. And it's very
used to be normal.
It feels
here. It used to be normal people that lived here too.
Well, it used to be, and that's
that changed somewhere along the way.
That's a very interesting idea. That's probably a good signifier of where we're at in the United States. Also, there's a way in which it's hard to practically think about how you're going to make it better for your kids when you're living in the United States.
Because that's
a slightly difficult thing. It's not exactly clear what you need to do, because we've established relatively reliable food sources. We've established relatively reliable plumbing and access to water and ideally access to food. I mean, this is probably why mental health is a thing that people are turning to, but that's a whole nother topic. But this bleakness of knowing your limits I think it does force you to it's a forcing function for this as well, to say
Right.
that I need
Right.
to invest in my offspring because that's the continuation.
Yeah, and well, what you get to there with offspring is kind of the next thing I wanted to point out, is that there's kind of something cyclical in this as well, as we talked about the masculine and the feminine. And so if we look at God's instruction here, or proclamation to the two of them combined, what we see is there's something of a cyclical nature there too, right? Where the masculine sort of slogs forward through the muck and the mire and produces the bread that then feeds the feminine as it bursts. We talked about the idea of a new masculine, right? And that it sort of then replaces, the previous masculine, right? Hence the dust to dust, right? Whereas there's not sort of that description of a death or whatever in terms of the feminine. You see that here in terms of the masculine, that there's a description of the death. And so that's kind of interesting that you get it here. That's where I think I can look at and see some of that idea of like the feminine birthing new masculine. Let's remember, it was specifically masculine, the term for children, the offspring, right, in the previous words to the woman as well. So we kind of, that is more or less the cyclical process by which we improve ourselves, right? We use the sort of the masculine that we are to kind of go out and get the bread that will feed the changes within us, right? To become a better and better version of ourselves. And so I think we see then, if we look at this, I think you can see both sort of like this individual level that this process works at as well as a societal level too. So there's something cyclical there. We've talked so much about the masculine and feminine. I wanted to make sure we tie the two together here and show that actually this cycle works between the two as well. So, all right. And so I want to note here real quickly, this is the end of what God has said to the man and woman, right? And I think it's worth noting here that in terms of everything he has said, none of that would invalidate the thing that we've talked about previously in Genesis 1, the idea of the command to subdue and fill the earth and fulfill this role as imagers, right? Nothing he said here would negate that. In fact, what he's done is maybe described how the task will become more difficult. Yet maybe, as you were saying, right, sort of the inspiration that we could take from this, it's also how to get past the difficulty, right? Make the bread, have the children, from the feminine perspective. That's how we will get past it. But that particular command, I think, still remains. And so I want to call that out just specifically because I think Christians sometimes forget that, and too regularly. I get a sense sometimes in my consumption of various Christian content and thought and whatnot, there's sometimes a bit of an attitude of just sort of like struggling to make it through until Christ returns, right? That's what we're here to do. Just don't screw up until he gets back. And I think I again, nowhere in here do I ever see a cease to the command to multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. So, and in this case specifically, the presence of sin, which we saw in this chapter, does nothing to invalidate that very first command to us. So, all right. Well, with that, we're gonna call it a wrap, I think. And be sure to like, subscribe, follow us wherever, and email us unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we will catch you again next time. Thanks.